The Vietnam War is ingrained in our social memory, not only by the hundreds of thousands of Vietnam veterans still living today, but by many films and TV shows that reference the conflict. But how much do you really know about this divisive war? Let's delve into the issue that not only split Vietnam further, but bitterly divided America and sparked the anti-war movement. Vietnam had a long history of colonization. It had been a French colony since 1877 and was invaded by Japan during World War II. During the Japanese invasion, Vietnam politician Ho Chi Minh drew inspiration from the communist countries of China and Russia. He decided to fight off both the Japanese and the French and formed the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or the Viet Minh. After the Allies were victorious in World War II, Japan left Vietnam, reinstating Emperor Bao Dai as an essentially powerless figurehead. Bao Dai was a Vietnamese vassal of the French. Although he was born in Vietnam, he had spent most of his youth in France, where he was educated. Seeing an opportunity to rise, the Viet Minh, a communist left-wing opposing party, took over Hanoi in August 1945 and declared Ho Chi Minh president of a democratic Vietnam. Seeing this as a threat to their colonial hold over Vietnam, France backed Bao Dai. The French-run state of Vietnam was set up in 1949, with its capital at Saigon. Both Bao and Ho wanted to unify Vietnam, but they disagreed on how the nation should be run. Bao sought to model their society after Western culture and economics, keeping close ties with the democratic countries of the West. Ho and the Viet Minh wanted Vietnam to embrace the communist ideals of the Soviet Union and the newly formed People's Republic of China. Armed conflict erupted between the communists in the north and the French colonial south until May 1954, when the Viet Minh won a decisive victory at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This battle resulted in a treaty that officially split Vietnam along the 17th parallel. Ho formally maintained power in the north and Bao in the south. Both sides agreed that national elections would be held in 1956 to reunite the country. However, this election was swept off the table when Ngo Dinh Diem ousted Emperor Bao and became president of South Vietnam, also known as the Government of the Republic of Vietnam. Diem was a staunch anti-communist and appealed to America, which was embroiled in their own anti-communist conflict with the Soviet Union, for help. Dwight D. Eisenhower pledged his support to South Vietnam in their fight against the North. However, far from paving the way to a united Vietnam, Diem's rule further solidified the communist cause. Diem used the contemptuous term Viet Cong, meaning Vietnamese communist, to describe the Northern Democratic Republic of Vietnam supporters and hunted down any Ho Chi Minh followers in the South. Around 100,000 people were arrested, with many being tortured and executed. By 1957, the Northern Vietnamese guerrillas had adopted the name Viet Cong and, alongside other opposers to Diem, began attacking southern targets, including government officials. By 1959, the conflict had escalated to firefights. In 1960, all of Diem's opponents united and formed the National Liberation Front, regardless of their political ideology. Although this group stated it was autonomous, many in the U.S. government saw it as a communist organization. In 1961, fueled by anti-communist fervor, an American team sent to assess the situation in Vietnam advised John F. Kennedy to increase American aid to Diem. They worked off the premise that if one Southeast Asian country fell to communism, it would create a domino effect wherein others would follow. Although JFK did not commit to a full-scale invasion, by 1962, 9,000 U.S. military troops were stationed in South Vietnam. The following year, just 3 weeks before the assassination of Kennedy, Diem and his brother were killed in a coup by their generals. The resulting political instability motivated Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's successor, to increase U.S. military support of South Vietnam even further. In August 1964, torpedo boats from the Northern Democratic Republic of Vietnam attacked U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Despite being in southern Vietnam for nearly 10 years, this incident spurred America to join the war in earnest. Johnson ordered the bombing of North Vietnam, starting with military targets. The government then approved the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which resulted in regular bombing raids, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. But it wasn't just Vietnam that was targeted. To try and disrupt supply chains along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the U.S. bombed Laos, the neutral neighbor of North Vietnam. The bombing of Laos was also an attempt to prevent the rise of the Lao Communist Forces, Pathet Lao, and was conducted during the CIA's secret war. By 1965, there was enough support from the American people to send combat forces to Vietnam, and by June, 82,000 combat troops were sent into battle, with calls for a further 175,000 by the end of the year. Despite general support for the Vietnam War, there was a growing anti-war movement. Some Americans had started to question the validity of the claim that the war was to liberate the South Vietnamese from communist aggressions. 1965 saw more young people, as well as prominent intellectuals and artists, voice their objections to the war amid the expanding hippie culture of the era. But it wasn't just America that supported South Vietnam, although they sent soldiers on a much larger scale than any other country. Thailand, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia sent troops to fight against North Vietnam and were there until the end of the war. In addition to the air raids that targeted North Vietnam, ground troops fought throughout the South under General William Westmoreland and General Nguyen Thieu. Westmoreland's aim was not to secure territory, but to kill as many supporters of Ho Chi Minh as possible. He designated areas in South Vietnam as free fire zones, where all innocent civilians were supposedly evacuated, so any enemies remaining in the zones would be destroyed by shelling or by bombs dropped by B-52 aircraft. These areas were left uninhabitable, causing the Vietnamese who lived there to become refugees, who were then forced into camps near southern cities, including Saigon. Despite the mounting death toll, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the Viet Cong refused to cease fighting. Support from China and the Soviets helped them strengthen their air defenses, while additional workforces and supplies continued to be delivered via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In November of 1967, it seemed that the war was far from over. American troops stationed in Vietnam now reached nearly 500,000. 15,058 American soldiers had lost their lives, with 109,527 sustaining serious injuries. Washington's claims that the war was being won, plus the complex political situation and the unfamiliar climate and terrain, resulted in many U.S. soldiers losing morale. They began to question the motives for their continued presence in Vietnam, and many of them had developed severe substance abuse issues. Vietnam soldiers had access to marijuana, cocaine, LSD, mescaline, psilocybin mushrooms, and heroin. Half of the troops stationed there smoked marijuana, and 28% reported taking hard drugs. But these black market acquisitions weren't the only problem. The U.S. military command had started prescribing amphetamines to boost the endurance of their troops and sedatives to manage their anxiety. Surprisingly, it seems that the sedatives worked in addressing the mental state of the troops, at least in the short term, as only 1% of soldiers in Vietnam had mental breakdowns, compared to 10% during World War II. Retrospectively, many argue that the use of amphetamines and the resulting withdrawal caused young servicemen in Vietnam to commit atrocities against Vietnamese civilians. Strung out and stressed by the conditions of war in a foreign country, many men unleashed their frustration and anxiety through violence directed at the Vietnamese people. During the war's later years, the American soldiers increasingly suffered from physical and psychological deterioration. As well as the effects of prolonged heavy drug use, the men began showing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Many rebelled and attacked officers, and between July 1966 and December 1973, around 503,000 troops deserted. The anti-war protests in America had turned violent, leading to deaths and incarcerations of anyone found to display anti-war sentiments in both the U.S. and Vietnam. Horrific images of the war had begun to be broadcast, and America's general populace started to be less supportive of the ongoing conflict. It was argued that the United States' involvement supported a corrupt dictatorship and that the primary victims were Vietnamese civilians rather than military combatants. But back to the war. At the beginning of 1968, the North tried to strike a major blow against the South and launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. It was named the Tet Offensive, as it coincided with the new lunar year. While the attacks were not in themselves successful, reports of them, coupled with Westmoreland requesting 200,000 more troops, exposed the fact that the war was far from over, contradicting what the government had been asserting. Johnson's approval rating dropped, and he eventually called the bombing of the North to a halt, although it continued in the South. This move was met with a positive response from the government in Hanoi, and in May 1968, peace talks between the U.S. and North Vietnam commenced in Paris. South Vietnam and the National Liberation Front were later included in the negotiations, which soon reached an impasse. Unfortunately, Johnson had only halted bombing 1 week before the election, which did no favors for Hubert H. Humphrey, the next Democrat running for president. Humphrey was up against Republican Richard Nixon, who made vague promises of peace, saying he had a secret plan for Vietnam and would end the draft, crack down on drugs, and restore law and order. When Nixon won the presidency, he tried to deflate the anti-war movement, as he believed the silent majority of Americans still supported the war in Vietnam. To limit further American casualties but continue to aid South Vietnam, Nixon planned to start withdrawing troops, but increase air raids and supply the South with training and weaponry. He also continued the peace talks in Paris, but they reached a stalemate as the North Vietnamese insisted on the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops. The anti-war movement was not mollified. The revelation that in March 1968, the U.S. military had massacred as many as 500 unarmed civilians in the village of My Lai further fueled the anti-war sentiment. In November 1969, about 500,000 American citizens attended an anti-war demonstration in Washington. It called for the immediate withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. This issue divided America. While some rejected the government's narrative, others considered supporting the war to be their patriotic duty. In 1970, the U.S. and South Vietnam invaded Cambodia in another attempt to cut off the supply line of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. This attack preceded a South Vietnamese invasion of Laos. The raids violated international law and set off a new wave of protests in America. Then, in 1971, the New York Times published an article that proved Nixon had ramped up the Vietnamese conflict rather than attempt to bring it to a peaceful conclusion. The report further weakened public support for the ongoing war. By 1972, Nixon finally ended the draft in favor of a volunteer army, and in the same year, Hanoi showed their willingness to compromise. A peace agreement was drafted, but rejected by the leaders in Saigon. In December, several bombing raids authorized by Nixon drew international criticism, demonstrating that support for the war was waning. The new year saw talks between North Vietnam and the U.S. finally reach a peaceful conclusion, and open hostilities between the two nations ended. The North-South conflict continued until 1975, when the Democratic Republic of Vietnam
كنت ميتا في بحور الغي والإثم غريقا كنت عابدا في قيود الذنب مملوكا رقيقا مد لي الشيطان من أسبابه حبلا وثيقا منكرات كنت آتيها غروبا وشروقا كنت ميتا في بحور الغي والإثم غريقا كنت عابدا في قيود الذنب مملوكا رقيقا مد لي الشيطان من أسبابه حبلا وثيقا منكرات كنت آتيها.
As 1.5 million. The U.S. had spent over $120 billion on the failed war that had cost around 47,000 Americans their lives. The surviving soldiers faced many negative reactions upon returning to the U.S. Those who opposed the conflict viewed them as war criminals, and the war's supporters saw them as failures. The veterans suffered from the
كنت ميتا في بحور الغي والإثم غريقا كنت عابدا في قيود الذنب مملوكا رقيقا مد لي الشيطان من أسبابه حبلا وثيقا منكرات كنت آتيها غروبا وشروقا كنت ميتا في بحور الغي والإثم غريقا كنت عابدا في قيود الذنب مملوكا رقيقا مد لي الشيطان من أسبابه حبلا وثيقا منكرات كنت آتيها غروبا وشروقا كنت ميتا في بحور الغي الغي والإثم غريقا، كنت عابدا في قيود الذنب مملوكا رقيقا، مدني الشيطان من أسبابه حبلا وثيقا، منكرات كنت آتيها غروبا وشروقا، غازت الآثام لحمي ثم عظمي والعروقا، كنت في التفحيط نجما يبهر الدنيا بريقا، أجهد